welcome to Self-Made and Sober. I'm your host, Andrew Lassise with selfmade-coaching.com. And in this podcast, it's my job to interview people who are not only crushing it in business, but have also struggled with addiction in the past and are in long-term recovery. Be sure to join our Facebook group where we help entrepreneurs grow and scale their business at facebook.com/groups/SMC Mastermind, like Self-Made Coaching Mastermind. I hope you enjoy the show, and be sure to subscribe and rate the show afterwards so you can get notified each Friday when we put out a new episode. With me today is the indie spiritualist Chris Grosso. He's an author, speaker, best known for his book Dead Set on Living, which is actually revered as one of the top 5 addiction books of all time. And Chris, I love the subtitle, On Making the Difficult but Beautiful Journey from Fucking Up to Waking Up.
Story of my life, which is still very much ongoing.
So you want to give us a little background on how you came up with the subtitle? I love that.
Yeah, I mean, it's my third book. My first book was Indie Spiritualist, which that and Everything Mind came out in 2014 and 2015. Everything Mind was my second book. And they were like part autobiographical, but also trying to distill these teachings from a lot of Eastern philosophy and, things that younger people, because that's a large demographic I work with, may not otherwise be interested in. So I'm trying to distill it in a way that makes it more accessible while, keeping it interesting with my own journey. And I only mention that, that's not a plug. I mention that because, I have these 2 books out that do really well. They're with major publishers, and I'm traveling and speaking at conferences and, in front of thousands of people and just very well known for, in the recovery community. And I end up relapsing, and not only relapsing, but I was literally like dead. It was a 24-hour relapse, and I ended up in a hospital bed. And I was intubated because I couldn't breathe on my own. So I had 1 tube in my lungs breathing for me. I had 1 in my stomach. They were just trying to suck out, because I was incoherent by the time I got to the hospital. Thank goodness my parents got me there when they did, because the doctor said, and no scare tactic, they were like, if you were here 5 minutes later, even if you survived, you would have been brain dead, because I wasn't breathing. So that it was after that within about 3 weeks, I had bounced back pretty quickly from that, and I was out for a run. I love jogging. That's a very important part of my recovery, that and exercise. And but anyways, it just kind of hit me while I was out running, the whole title and subtitle, just and most of my first 2 books, with the exception of Dead Set on Living, were written while I was out running. It's very odd, but once I hit that 4 or 5 mile mark, it's my mind is clear, and I would usually run 8 to 12 miles, and I would, I'd have these ideas pop into my head. I'd get home, and I wrote those books literally, I'd be sweating because I wouldn't even take a shower. I'm like, I need to write this right away, and I'm sweating all over my keyboard. But so Dead Set that's about the title and subtitle, and it's a completely different approach, where it's all right, I've written 2 books, and, I was sober for I think around 5 years, something like that at that point, after numerous relapses, even prior to that. But for me, I always would get a year, 2 years, 3 years. So 95% of my time in this 20-year journey has been sober, but I had these relapses. And anyways, so that's why I took a different approach with this book, where each chapter is a narrative conversation with neuroscientists, teachers, spiritual teachers, addiction experts. I wanted to get this all-encompassing view with the underlying theme being, why do we return to self-destructive behaviors even when we know better? Because at this point, it's all right, I've already written 2 books about what's worked for me, and obviously I still fell off. So it's time for me to churn and talk to other people and get a very literally holistic, all different viewpoints chiming in on these different, their different perspectives. So sorry for the long-winded answer, but that's how the subtitle came about, and a whole lot of info that you didn't ask for.
Well, I mean, that's the whole idea behind, getting behind what's going on in your mind at that time. Because I mean,
Yeah.
you know, and writing the book, did you go in a different direction than when you initially started, when you were doing your research and going through, or was it pretty much start to finish, you knew how it was going to be?
Yeah, with the third book, I absolutely knew. The first two books were different. They were intentionally written kind of in a way where they're shorter vignettes, and you don't have to read it in order. It's not like a chapter by chapter book. Whereas Dead Set on Living is, I mean, you could also with Dead Set pick it up and read it. It doesn't have to be red cover to cover, but we did try to set some kind of a thread for it. Um, so that one, it was pretty much I had the vision, whereas the first two books, the first book actually, I remember I was joking, half joking with my editor. She was like, I'm thinking about maybe just taking each vignette title, putting it up on a cork board and throwing darts at it, and we're just going to decide the order from there. And we could have done that, and it still would have worked. But yeah, with that said, it definitely was more intentional.
So you were talking about how we return to self-destructive behaviors, and what would you say are probably the one or two biggest reasons why people do return to self-destructive behaviors?
Mm. So, oddly, a therapist helped me after all these years. I still see a therapist weekly because I'm still a very fucked up individual. I am a much more productive member of society, and I'm grateful for that. But I still drop the ball in every possible way that I can. And I've been transparent about that since my first book. That's something that I've always wanted to do, was show the humanity in this journey of healing, regardless of it's drugs or alcohol, whatever. We're all healing from something. And you know, I've read books where it's like the teachers almost come off as perfect, and it's like they're setting these unrealistic expectations. And I wanted to be the polar opposite of that. So, um, anyways, but to answer your question, for me, I say that because a therapist I was seeing, I'm seeing a different therapist now, but this was after the relapse, and they had helped me to understand that, as weird as this will sound, or as counterintuitive as this may sound, going back to those self-defeating behaviors, not that as an excuse, but was actually an act of compassion for myself. And the reason he explained that was that we have these deeply ingrained neural pathways in our brain, and if we're not taking care of ourselves and doing what we know we need to do in our recovery or our healing journey, then those neural pathways start to get stronger again. And even though those behaviors, like in my case, alcohol or drugs, that could ultimately end in my death, there is the limbic brain. We have this triune brain, which consists of three parts. And when we are in a relapse mode, which, as I'm sure you know, happens well before we pick up the drug or the drink, we start, engaging in behaviors that are not self-serving. And once we do pick up the drug or the drink, we go back into our limbic brain, which is the oldest part of our brain, like or I'm sorry, reptilian brain. It's associated with caveman and survival, fight or flight, and then also our midbrain, which is emotions. And even though consciously our neocortex, which is the part of our brain where does the conscious rational thinking, is still there, we're controlled by those two old, the reptilian brain and the midbrain. And so it's that act of survival. And that when he used that word compassion, I remember just being like, how is that possible? But as he explained, like, that's what's ingrained, that survival mechanism, like that's what you're resorting back to. And that's why when you see people using, like, they will literally use to their death unless they get help or some kind of intervention. So that's one thing that I recognize, or he helped me shine a light on. And so again, I'm not saying that's an excuse to go use. It's just that I had a lot of shame and guilt around relapsing, especially after having so much sobriety and writing books. And, he was not a therapist. I never get involved with therapists that are yes men or women. It's like, call me on my shit. Otherwise, it's not going to help me. And he very much would. But I really appreciated him making that distinction for me. But again, and, not to beat a dead horse, but not an excuse, just helping me to understand. So for me, the second part, because I think you said like, what are two things? The biggest thing for me was that through all those years, and even though I was doing therapy and I was doing 12-step meetings and various other kind of recovery meetings and exercising and eating well and essentially doing everything you're taught to do, to engage in a very full spirited recovery, there was still some very deep underlying stuff there. And even though I would write on steps and do this and do that and do a lot of what the 12 steps suggests, and I'm neither pro nor anti anything. I want to be very clear that I am pro find what works for you and go that route, whatever it is. That's all I care about. But what made a huge difference, made like a life changing difference, was I started with trauma based therapy. And that has allowed me to go into those very dark, often unconscious places that I wasn't even aware of, hence unconscious, like that material that I had just shoved down. Swiss psychologist Carl Jung calls it shadow material. And this allowed me to start connecting dots to emotional attachments I had to certain memories. Or even if the memories weren't there, still just that, you may have heard this saying, the issues are in the tissues. So even if we don't remember specific occurrences in our lives, that trauma is still held within the tissues. So two examples of the therapy. One is EMDR, and it's like eye movement desensitization, something. You can look it up. M is in Michael, D is in David, R is in Robert. And now I do a form of therapy that was born out of that called ART, which is accelerated resolution therapy. And that has been, like I said, life changing for me, because it takes me to those parts where I'm uprooting, re-owning, and reintegrating the shadow material that would bring me back to that place of relapse. So we're all unique individuals. And just like I don't advocate for one 12 step over another or 12 steps in general, same with therapy. I'm just sharing from me what's literally changed my life.
I think it's important that you establish too that like what works for you is what works for you. And just because it only works for Chris, like what works for you is not what works for Andrew. And
Right.
neither of us is right or wrong in saying what
Right.
works for us works or doesn't work, because
Yeah.
if it works, then who are you to say that it's not working? I think we just get we get this snowflake idea that
Yeah.
if we if we have success in one thing, then everybody needs to do that. Like we have a 8-month-old, and every parent, here is how you solve this problem. And it's like
Right.
you see what even within families, children that were literally brought up by the exact same parents
Yeah.
that are just completely opposite people, and it's trying to apply, here is a solution that worked in this vacuum, and assuming that it's always going to work. I do think you need to find what works for you and to stay open-minded,
Oh,
because
yeah.
a lot of times they'll be people in 12-step recovery, very very much you have to do 12-step recovery, otherwise your life is terrible. And
Right.
I had believed that for a long time until, and I am personally pro 12-step, but at the
Yeah.
same time, like you're sitting here, well, like virtually across from me, saying you're happy without it. So who who are those people to say that you're not happy? Like,
Right.
are you happy? Is it working for you?
And so amen to that. And that's the thing that, I still, to be transparent, will attend 12-step fellowship meetings from time to time. I don't nearly as much as I used to. I currently don't like have a sponsor. I'm not actively writing on steps, but
Then
like
you're
I
not
said,
happy.
and I'm miserable. And no, I mean, but that's the thing. Like I know people that have so like over 10, 20 years in recovery that never did a 12-step program, and they're not white knuckling it or grumpy. They found their healing and their recovery in meditation or yoga, or a lot of people like myself will integrate and do 12 steps and this. And it always bothered me that like, I preferred one fellowship over another, but I found benefit in both. And I would read the literature from both because I think there was a wealth of information. And regardless if people aren't in recovery, my mom, for example, has read both of the major texts from each fellowship, and she's not in recovery, but they've just like changed her, not changed her life, but really opened her eyes to, life. And she's like, everyone should read these books. And I agree. But what I was going to say was, I found it so petty that like this fellowship is the one to go to and that one's not. And same with like spirituality. It's like, hey, if it's working for you, awesome. Like, just live and let live, like as long as you're not harming yourself or anyone else, who cares what the other person is doing if they're, happy and helping others and being, well to themselves. At the end of the day, that is all that matters as far as I'm concerned. And like insides, not outsides. Like that's what so I connect with people, and I don't care what they listen to or watch or look like. I mean, like, sure, it's cool if we have stuff in common, but where is your heart at? Like, what are you passionate about? What are you doing in this world to make it a better place? That's what I care about. And I just wish more. Well, no, there are a lot of people that have that attitude. I just wish there were more. And that's why it's a pleasure speaking with someone like yourself who, is involved in the fellowship, but can be open-minded and recognize there are other ways that work as well. This just happens to be what works for me. And I will say, I know tons of people as well that are very happy in the fellowships and live a wonderful life. So in no way I want to be clear, I'm not anti at all. Like, they've early on in my recovery, I owe them so much, and I still do, because they laid a foundation. It was just that for me, I needed that extra. Like, the one thing I will say, I interviewed a addiction expert, Gabor Mate, who's in the second chapter of my book, and he is very world renowned and can be controversial because he is very much pro, if it's for you, the use of things like ayahuasca and plant medicines and healing, which I know in 12 Steps is a very taboo subject. But Gabor had said that shit, where was I going with that? Um, I lost my train of thought, and it was a good point too.
One or the other?
Um, oh, yes. So what Gabor said was the one thing with the 12 steps that he feels is lacking is and any either fellowship is the focus on trauma. So, that you write on the 12 steps, and that's awesome. And I have in both fellowships. And like I said, they were a great foundation. But in that conversation I had with him for Dead Set, we talked about that. And I went back and I looked, and he's right. There is a lack of trauma-based approach. And for me, that was what kept leading me back to relapse. Now, like I said, I know plenty of people that do the programs and don't relapse and have many, many years sober, and that's incredible. But for some people like me, you need a little more. And then just a quick, interesting aside regarding one fellowship, I do find it interesting that the older of the eldest of the fellowships, while respecting anonymity here, but after a certain creator of the eldest of fellowships passed away, and I've seen these with my own eyes, and you can find them online if you do enough digging. There were early pamphlets in, I believe it was the 40s, written before certain literature was released, where one of the two co-founders of this fellowship wrote about the positive aspects of things like hallucinogenics in your recovery. He also wrote about Buddhism and meditation, and you won't find that anywhere in the appropriated literature today. But I have seen, with my own eyes, like early on, there it was there, and once this gentleman passed away, it kind of got swept into the rug. Like a lot of major religions, like they start out as this beautiful thing, and the mystic elements are still wonderful, but then when they become like man-made and they become egoic and let's make it fit our mold and our model, and it has to be our way, and it just distorts. And so I'm not saying that the fellowships are distorted. I'm just saying one of them particularly is lacking and in certain areas, and kind of disregarded some very important information. But that's like a whole nother show.
Yeah, I've done a lot of research on the origins of 12-step recovery, and you're absolutely right. Like, the way that it's taught today is very, very different
Yeah.
than the way that it originally was. And the way that it used to be had a much higher success rate than the way that it currently does. But the people who are successful in it today, they are the ones that are carrying on the message of this is how it's supposed to be done,
Right.
because our minority is those that are successful in it. And if you falter, it is your fault, even though that's not how it initially was. But
No, at
it
all.
it's very interesting to see how it's evolved over the years and how it's kind of become a 80-year long game of telephone, even though
Yes.
there's very clear instructions on how and what to do, but each person puts their own spin on it, and everyone kind of it is what it is. Like you said, it's
Yeah.
a huge rabbit hole. But I'm curious on this stint of sobriety, because like you said, you've been in and out for years, majority of it in. But what would you say is different this time versus all the other attempts that you've had at sobriety?
Yeah, so the major one, which I mentioned, was the trauma-based therapy. That was something I had never done, and I lead at least 3 to 4 times a month. I lead workshops. I live in Connecticut with teenagers that are in a residential. They're about 13 to 18 years old. Um, and I mean, it's nothing like any of the rehabs that I went to. Like the ones I went to were like a step above the jail cells I've been in. Like I got what I needed, but these are very beautiful settings, a wonderful approach. They have like equine therapy, they have yoga come in. I go in and, like I said, do 3 or 4 workshops a month. And they also offer EMDR therapy there, which is incredible. And that it's actually the owner, the gentleman who started those. There's a few of them throughout the country. He was the one who suggested EMDR to me, and I had heard about it, and I'd heard good things, but I'd never heard or never tried it. And so it was once I started to do that, really, like I said, I feel like the best example I can give was prior to that. It's like when you're weeding a garden, like if you're just cutting the weed, it's going to grow back versus with this trauma based therapy, I'm actually pulling it out by the root. So like these things like that thought I was healing through, and some of them I did, um, weren't fully healed. And like I said earlier, weren't fully re-owned and reintegrated. And another thing that I'm doing differently is that I don't like count a sobriety date. People are always like, how long you been sober? And it's like, I have no idea. I love the just for today. I know it's cliche, but some people are like, if you woke up earlier than me today, you're sober longer. I used to kind of snark at that, but now I'm like, you know what? Yes. And the reason I say that is because it's a mental disorder. It's this obsessive compulsive thought disorder, and the drugs and the alcohol are just symptoms. That's not the actual problem. So I will catch myself, even though I haven't touched drugs and alcohol in a while. I've had a good run. I will still catch myself at times maybe eating the same exact way that I would when I was actively using drugs or alcohol. So, like, even though I'm not hungry, I'm just like going back and forth to the kitchen, just eating like junk food. And it's doing the same thing. It's like masking something I don't want to feel or numbing something. And so, even though it's not, again, a drink or a drug, it's the same exact behavior. So, to me, even though I guess I'm quote sober because I'm not under the influence of, this or that, still like chocolate and sugar changes your brain chemistry. So I am at that point where I'm that nitpicky with myself about it. So it's like I that's why I don't bother. To me, it's not one thing or another. It's our actions and our behaviors. So and that's why you'll also see people that get sober and are just miserable because they don't, they're white knuckling it and they don't take the time to really heal. Um, so yeah, it's like I'll have a long stint where I'm doing well with food and everything, but then I'll have a day where I just fall off and I eat like garbage for a day, or pardon me, I will like binge TV for like 4 hours. That happens rarely because I work so much, but it happens. And I recognize it. It's the same exact thing, just a different quote unquote substance. So that's the other thing that I find is help because I don't feel the pressure of like, I have this much amount of time and these, this keychain or this coin, and nothing wrong with that. Cause that to me, going back 20 years for the first 5+ years of into this journey, those meant so much to me, like something to look forward to. And I understand and celebrate the importance of clean time and things of that nature, especially for those newer in recovery. Because those are like lifelines, and they gave me something to look for and work towards, and I'm so grateful for that. But again, 20 years later, it's like been there, done that. Now it's just like one day at a time, literally, and not counting days. Just I've got today, if that, because once we get off this call, like, I have other stuff to do and I'll be going out. Who knows if I'll get in a car accident? Not to be morbid, but who knows? I already feel like I'm living on borrowed time. I actually had this conversation with my fiance not that long ago, and again, not to sound morbid, but if I were to die today, I don't want to die today. I want to be very clear. I enjoy my life and it's far from perfect. Like, I could always be better at this or that or whatever. But if I were to die today, I would still feel like it was a gift because I've lost so many people, like countless, to overdoses, to suicides, drug deals gone bad, things of that nature. Anyone in recovery can relate to that. But it's to the point where I've literally lost count. I can't tell you how many people I've known over the years. And I used to say I should have died because the way I was, and I did, like I said earlier, like I had the tube breathing for me, the way I lived, like I could have died so many times over. So I do deal with like survivor's guilt at times still, and things of that nature. But it helps again, just not having that, you know, date for whatever reason that it's like an anti thing for me. No, I am not anti date. It doesn't like, it adds like a certain semblance of stress in my life that, it's counterproductive for my well-being. So
It's a very interesting thought. And, on the intake form for the show, we say, when's your current sobriety date? And you'd put in there that it's just for today, there isn't a date. And I think that's a really cool way of looking at it. And again, it's like a polar opposite of how I look at it.
yeah,
But at the same time, if that works for you, then that's all that matters. Like, we are all humans and there isn't a cookie cutter. This works for me, therefore it works for you. It should just
right,
be at, this works for me. Here is my experience. And that's all I can speak on. And
right,
you were talking, about like getting help with the trauma in your life and how 12 steps doesn't address that. And there are people though that believe, I saw a meme earlier and it was like, oh, well, I've been sober for 9 years. So that makes me an authority on your finances and your love life
right,
and your trauma and your history and
yeah,
what jobs you should be working. And it's like,
right,
we take this narrow little issue, well, not little, we take this tiny piece though of our lives and then just blow it up into, well, I can't do this thing because I'm an alcoholic. And it's like, well,
right,
I mean, it may not be, but then again, for some people it very well is everything all or nothing. And
yes,
we just passed Halloween at the time of this recording,
yeah,
and I hadn't really pieced it together until you said, but I've been eating a ton of chocolate recently because we just
yeah,
had leftovers, and I just threw out the basket of it yesterday with a
yep,
ton left. I found myself every time I walk downstairs, it's like, oh, just grab a piece of candy, grab a piece
yeah,
of candy. But I hadn't eaten candy in, well, probably since last Halloween,
yeah,
and I can tell that my head isn't in a as good of spot as it usually is. And I was trying to figure it out this morning. What's been different? And it was like, I guess that candy is probably, and then you mentioned it. So I'll take that as a firm, the sugar and chocolate, these things that we
yeah,
take it to extremes. And like you
exactly,
said, the drugs and alcohol, like that's a symptom. And when you
right,
get rid of the symptom and you still have the problem,
yes,
that's way, way worse. Because
right,
if your life sucks and then you take drugs or a drink and then it feels better, even though on a scale of 1 to 10, I talk about this a lot, like my life before is a baseline at a 2,
Sure.
and then it was up to a 5 when I was using. So it would make sense that I'd want to keep hitting that 5 out of 10, because I wasn't aware of 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, what any of that felt like, because all I knew was I could get up to a 5 if I'm under the influence. So you take
Right.
that away, and now I'm just stuck at a 2 without any solution to anything. You've
Right.
done exactly like you said. You just weeded the garden by chopping off the top of the weed, but it's just going to come right back instead of
Yeah.
actually getting rid of it. I love that insight.
And I just want to say I love that scale idea because like I think of it as like it's very similar. Like let's say 1 is lowest, 10 is highest. You know, I I'm grateful that on most days I feel content. Most days, without substances, you said, it would take you to a 5. Most days, let's again, 10 is like bliss. Most days I'm at a 5, a 6, and that's like contentment. That's not like things are great, things are awesome, I'm feeling super happy. It's like I'm content, I'm at peace. Like it definitely, it's not, always a 5. Sometimes it's an 8, sometimes it's a 2, but it's generally like a 5 or a 6. And I remember early on, one of the first rehabs I went to, because our brain chemistries do shift and we can heal, but sometimes only to a certain extent, depending on the damage we've done. But one of the clinicians is like, what if you could only get to a certain point in your healing and recovery where you can't get past this, whatever level of happiness? That's something, everyone should be aware of because that might be the case. And I'm not saying that's the case in my life. I just remember like that really stuck with me. But I'm so compared to where I was living, like yourself, like I was at like a -2, let alone a 2, and I would get up to maybe like a 3 with my use. But like I'm at a 5, 6. And like I make it clear when I tell people, like, just because you are in recovery, or again, if it's not specifically recovery, healing from, because I work with people that are cutters or suicidal or have, various just mental health issues. So they're healing from something. It might not be specifically substances, but getting to that line of contentment, it's such a world of difference from being at that 2 or that 0, because it's like, wow, like just feeling a sense of ease. It, if you've been to that 2, which I'm guessing most of your listeners have, and I know you have, like that 5, like, I mean, 8's icing on the cake, 8 to 10, but like 5, 6, 7, that's awesome. Like, I'm so grateful just to be content. And one other thing I wanted to say is I appreciate that you're saying, like, just because I have 9 years or whatever, like, I'm the authority on everything. Like, I have 3 books out, majorly published, and I am the first person to say, I can only talk about my experience. I cannot tell you what to do in your life. I can share what has helped me. I can tell you pitfalls that I've fallen in. Some of this might help you, some of it might not, but all I can share is my experience. And I make that clear when I do my workshops. I sit on the floor with the teenagers. Like I don't, I'll speak at major conferences, and I understand I have to stand on a stage because there can be hundreds to thousands of people, but that makes me feel uncomfortable because I don't want to feel any different. I'm not any higher. Like I'm right there with you. I'm in the trenches going through this with you just because I am not using today and I have some books out. So what? Like I don't have any PhDs. I didn't finish. I was halfway through my internship for substance abuse counseling. Too much paperwork. I dropped out. Like, so I would have had my degree in that, and I don't. It's just like so. People tend to think that like I could see how easily having books published, I could be that guy. Like, well, I know this or that. No, I don't know shit. I know that I don't know shit. That's the one thing I do know, and I'll share what I can that maybe will help, but that's the best I can do.
I think that's a great perspective. And Chris, I want to be um, conscientious of your time. So, in wrapping up, where can people find you online and your books?
Yeah, everything can be found at the website, which is theindiespiritualist.com. It's either the Indie Spiritualist or just Indie Spiritualist. I don't know. You can Google it and it'll come up. My name or Indie Spiritualist. My name,
The
last name is, it is.
indiespiritualist.com.
Thank you. Yeah. Or yeah. So, but
Got
you
my
can find
handy
my
dandy notes.
books. Thank you, sir. My social media accounts, I think, are attached to that, and my books are all on Amazon, or you can find them at the website. And yeah, thank you for asking. I feel weird plugging stuff, so I appreciate you.
Well, I'll plug it in the show notes if anybody's interested. Feel free to reach out to me. We'll have all the links in the show notes. Reach out to Chris. It's so great having you on Self-Made and Sober. And guys, if you
Yeah.
liked the episode, please rate and subscribe on iTunes. It helps us grow the show. And Chris, have a great day. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor.
Thank you so much for listening to Self-Made and Sober. Be sure to join our Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/SMC Mastermind, like Self-Made Coaching Mastermind. I hope you enjoyed the show, and be sure to subscribe and rate the show so you can get notified each Friday when we put out a new episode.